Hey everybody, welcome to part 3 of the Getting Started tutorial mini-series. Now we've already got some basic game logic, so I'm going to show you now how to make a basic user interface using graphs. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to create a canvas in our scene, and we're going to make it a camera space. I like to do this just so that all our interface elements will appear in the same vicinity as all our other objects. And move this plane distance forward so it appears on top of our other objects. And now we will add a Text Mesh Pro object, just because we want to show a message. And import the default resources. Shouldn't take too long if you haven't done that already. And there we have a new object. We're going to call it message. And we'll just make it look a little better. And we don't want any of that. So there, we have a message. Now, to display text in this message, we use what we call an interface control. And an interface control is a component that allows UI elements and other objects to be controlled by graphs. Specifically, we're going to be using a message control since we want to change the text of this Text Mesh Pro component. So we will add a component to our message called message control. And you can see there's this display text field, which is the actual component that we'll be editing. So let's drag that down and reference it there. And now to alter that from our graph, we'll go back to our key graph. And we're going to create a new node called a show message node. Oh, and that already created in a nice spot for me. So we will add a connection there. And we'll call this key message. Now you can remember with our key and our door graphs, we had access to those objects via the context. Right? This is our key context. Now we need to get access to our interface control from the scene, and we can't do that via the context like we could with the key and the door. So we're going to do that using the scene keyword, and the scene keyword just gives us access to any of the objects in our scene by their name. So we can just say scene.message, and that will reference the message control that we have in the scene. And we'll just say, you got a key. Now there's these other two flags that aren't too important for right now. For right now, just uncheck wait for completion. And we do want this message to hide. And so click that, and then we want it to hide after 2 seconds. And if we play, we will see, yay, you got a key. So now let's go back to the door graph, excuse me, and we'll just make another message node on the false branch just to show you what you can do, and we'll reorganize this a little bit. It says can't open message, and the same thing, scene.message, and you need a key. So now if we play this, you can see you need a key, and it'll keep doing that every time we hit it. But then, boom, we got a key. Perfect. And now we can open the door just like we did before. So we have some basic messages. Pretty cool, simple stuff. So let's make it a little more complex. We'll do some input stuff. So let's go back to our player, and we're going to add a component called a Starcraft Trigger. So you remember that graph triggers were components that run graphs via various events. So this one is a start graph trigger, so it'll run a graph just when the scene starts up or when this object starts. So we're going to create a new instruction graph called, and this time we're going to make a scoped graph. We'll call this the start graph and put it in the graphs folder. And we can now open that up just right here. So you see that this start node has 3 different branches to start off. Now, all this is just for organizational purposes. It'll run each of these branches sequentially. So it'll start with the enter branch, run all its nodes, come back, run the process branch, and then continue on to the exit branch. All this is organizational for stuff like if you have scoped stuff where you have actions you want to run at the beginning of a graph and then you want them to kind of be canceled out at the end of the graph. It's just nice to have it so you can kind of see the parity between those two different types of nodes. I'll show you now. We do we'll disable object here at the beginning, and we'll make an re-enable object here at the end. So that's kind of the good paradigm to use this for. What we're going to do, so our player is our context, so we're going to go back to our start node, and we're going to name the context player, and we'll call this disable player, and we'll call this enable player. And each of those targets, I forgot to do it in the other one, needs to be called player. So now our start graph will run this node, and then it'll run our process, and then it'll run our exit. So let's do something in the middle. We're going to show a different message. Just a message that starts right at the beginning. That's start message. And like we did before, scene.message. And then we're going to call this, we're going to say press enter to start. And now this time we are going to wait for completion, and we're also going to auto hide, but we don't want this to wait at all. So this will auto hide as soon as we complete now. And I'll show you what happens. It's not going to be quite correct, but just for some learning points here. So you can see this says press enter to start. So our message is there, but we disabled our player and it's no longer visible. And that's not exactly the behavior we want. So let's go back into this. And I'm going to explain a little bit about the context definition. So right now the player is being run as the object that had the graph trigger, which is just the player game object itself. That's the default. So if we go where we defined the context name, right below there's this context definition. And this will define the type of our context. So we want this to be an object, and we don't want it to be the player's game object. We actually only want to disable that initial player script that we wrote, because that's the thing that handles input. So we'll type in player, and it should show up here. And there's our script that we wrote. So now when we say player on any one of these nodes, it's actually referencing just that player script, not the object as a whole. So now you can see when we start, the player is there, and you can't tell, but I am pressing buttons and he cannot move, which is perfect. But of course our graph won't continue because we have no way to dismiss this graph. Or this message, excuse me. So we do that. We want to do that when we press enter. So we go back to our message control, and we're going to add a message input. And all this does is sends input to our control based on this field, the accept button, which by default is submit. And if you go into the project settings of your project, you can see submit by default is the enter button. So now that's all we needed to do. We can play this. Scene will start. We can press enter. And now we can run around, get our key, open our door. Perfect. So now it's pretty boring when you just have dynamic texts or static text like that. So let's show you how to do some more dynamic text with inputs. So in our start message, let's go to start message. Before this, we are going to do a brace input dot level colon. So what this does is this adds an input variable to our graph. So if we go back to the start node again, you can see that we now have a variable kind of like our context name called input. And we can define the type, and we want this to be a string, and we don't need any constraints. And now anything that references this graph will have all these inputs appear in its inspector. So if we go to our player, on this start graph trigger, you can see this list now has level. And we can set this to a value, and we're going to call this first level, level 1. So this is really cool because now if you have multiple different objects that you want to run a graph slightly differently, then you can use them as inputs while still using the same graph, which is pretty awesome. So if we had a second level, we could have this same player object, but we could have this input, say level 2 or level 10. And I'll just show you that really quick. Now this says level 1, press enter to start. Of course our walls cover it up and it doesn't look so great, but this is just for fun. If we go back to our player, we can now do level 15. Press play. And there we go, level 15. So really, really awesome stuff. Just tons of things you can do with inputs, the context values, and running graphs dynamically like that. So we'll get into more stuff like that. Next, we're going to be doing some scene transitions. So we're going to make some multiple levels, and we can utilize that new input value. But for now, thanks for watching. Stay tuned.